So the purpose of this video is simply to orient you to the basics of what we need to be looking for in Essay 1. And this should work for the Africa, Oceania, and the Americas class, as well as for the Latin American class. And I'll be discussing a little bit the small differences that we'll see between the two. But this is also going to be shared with our writing fellow so that all of us can be communicating consistently with the students about this first essay assignment. So let's start with we're going to start with the essay instructions for AOA, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And so what they're going to do is they're going to go and choose two works from a museum. They're going to look at them closely while they are there and attempt to describe them, attempt to, in fact, translate that visual experience into prose. This is the big problem, really, of this assignment. And then when I've asked them when they get back then to revise that prose, revise that description of the object so that it is logical. And so what you want to be looking for, both in terms of mentoring them and later in terms of evaluating these things, is a logical description so that they start at the top and move towards the bottom, or they start at the left and move towards the right, or some combination of those two, or some other logical sort of process that they use so that the final goal is to be able to call up a decent mental image of the piece, or at least the important elements of the piece, to a reader who has not seen the object itself. That's really important. And they're going to do that for two different objects. With Latin America, the essay instructions require only one object, right? But it's the same idea that they start by describing, by translating that visual experience of the object into prose, and that they do that, they revise it so that it is logical. Now, the Latin American course doesn't stress nearly as much the idea that they have to stand in front of it or that they have to go to a museum and find that object. That's not workable yet, anyway, in terms of the Latin American material here in the city. That's going to change when the construction of the new Museum of Fine Arts building, but we're not there yet. So we're not going to worry about that. But the idea that you do this logically, you do it effectively, in that a person who's reading this, who's never seen the object, can get a mental image of that object or the important parts of that object. And then there's a second. So let's see. If we were looking at something like this incredible Lefebvre figure from the Metropolitan Museum, you would want to see the student starting with the headdress and moving down. Is probably the quickest and easiest way to get at this. Before they do that, before they start at the headdress and move down, you would want them ideally to talk about the fact that this is a single human figure in an animated pose, something like that, so that you have a sort of general or long shot moving into a more detailed then passage through the object in a logical fashion. So again, it's about really helping the reader visualize this object, and it's about doing it effectively. Now, the second thing that they're going to do is a formal analysis. And with the formal analysis, what you would want, say, with this Lefebvre figure, let's go to something that is probably much more probable in Latin America. Let's say here is a 19th century history painting. Again, they'll list the artist and title and date and et cetera that they find in the label or in the catalog that they're getting this from. But that's kind of rote. I'm not interested in the history of the artist, the history of Mexican painting up to the 19th century. I'm only interested in the actual experience of this painting. So what hopefully the student's going to do is to characterize it as a multi-figure composition that talks about something that is historical. That's all they really need to do as far as the context. And then they could talk about the sort of left to right or back or front to back spatial organization of this thing. And then in a formal analysis, what they would want to do is establish that the focal point of the painting clearly is this profile representation of a conquistador, and the idea that, of course, then his sword, bloodied sword, points directly down to a fallen indigenous person, that then moves around via the arm to an indigenous woman, who then it forms a sort of circle here. Now, that's a fairly sophisticated formal analysis. If they in fact get that this is the focal point and that everything else is sort of balanced on either side of it, it's the pivot point around which the entire composition turns, that would be fantastic. That would be great. Now, if they start showing how the visual sort of energy, the visual logic of the eye's movement around the piece works, then, that's a total A. I would say that's an A+, except we don't give them. So to come back and to sort of wrap this up, because it's really no more complicated than this. What we want is a description that calls forth the object for someone who hasn't seen it, and a formal analysis that shows us the structure of the composition, that shows us the logic of what the eye does when the eye is looking. It looks at this more quickly, more intently, and that's the focal point. To go back again to our 19th century history painting, the establishment of an area of interest is really, really important. Now, a lot of students will not be able to do that, even with your help and with all of the succinct yet very straightforward definition of how to do a formal analysis in their materials. But we want to help them do it without giving them the answer. They have to sort of work through the fact that pictures have structure, and that the structure of the picture needs to be defined by the critic or historian, so that the reader can experience that structure, can see the logic of the picture. And that's really, in the end, what we're going for. So I hope that you focus on, whenever you're working with students, either with their papers as you evaluate them or as you're mentoring these students. I hope you work with those two stages, sort of the description and then the formal analysis. Now, all of that said, and I'm going to end with this, that the most sophisticated students will realize early on that this is a silly distinction, that the description really should include a formal analysis as you describe. I mean, that's the economical and effective way to do things, really, is that you should go through the description showing the reader already what's important and what's not, and how the picture is organized through your description itself. Now, again, if students are moving towards that, help them. And if they can already produce that in this first draft, this first try at a description and formal analysis, that is fantastic, and it's going to deserve an A without even looking. You don't have to read those very carefully. If they're doing something that integrates description and formal analysis, give them an A. But you are not required, the student is not required to integrate the description and formal analysis, right? And if you look at the rubrics for, well, I'll just take the rubric for AOA because I know where it is. The rubric for this first section, or this first attempt, the description and formal analysis, is basically a logical description. You see that here. as well as an insightful formal analysis. And that what I mean with by a pointed and logical description, that means they really get at the process of looking, or the process of seeing the piece, and they do it logically, again, top to bottom, left to right, both, if you need to be something like that, bottom to top if that's more appropriate. The order is not interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the fact that they employ an order. And the other thing is an insightful formal analysis that really allows the reader to see what's important in the piece and how things are organized around that central area of interest. So we'll be looking for all of these things. We'll all be on the same page when we're helping students. And I greatly appreciate, again, your time and effort in really nurturing good writing in art history at the University of Houston.